Welcome to USA Watchdog. I'm Greg Hunter. With us today, a guy we had on a while ago, bright man, PhD in pathology. He's also an expert in finance. Came out back in 2008 with a video series, a long one called Crash Course. I think I was at the networks. I watched it all. I thought, wow, why isn't this guy on mainstream TV? Well, we all know the story about the MSM. But anyway, back again, Chris Martenson from peakprosperity.com. Chris Martenson, thank you so much for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
Greg, it's a real pleasure to be back.
Well, you have reason why you're on. Just out recently, you have your latest accelerated crash course, this long series. It's almost 4.5 hours that you're releasing, a few chapters at a time. You released a few last week already. And to give an umbrella, to oversimplify this, it really is we're living well beyond our means and well beyond what the resources of this planet can really give us. And you can see it in everyday stories. And let's start by kind of talking about your accelerated crash course by incorporating it into the current news events. I know you follow everything on your site, including Iraq, because the oil story is a big one. I mean, at its core, it's about a religious war, but on top of that, it is about oil and fighting over natural resources in Iraq. Tell me your perspective on this.
Well, that's all absolutely correct. Resources are something that we've been able to ignore for a long time as a species, right? The Federal Reserve could just print money and trust that there would always be sufficient resources there. It was just a function of money. If we demanded it, supply would show up. We're in a new world. Supply doesn't always show up with demand anymore. We all know you can demand as much bluefin tuna as you want, but the oceans are stripped clean. We know that cheap oil is completely gone. We can demand as much of it as we want, but it's not there to be had, except in a couple of places like Iraq. So that's really a lot of context for that story. Now, you mentioned the crash course. It put together economy, very important. We need a functioning economy. That's critical, but you can't have one unless you have energy. I'll give you all the resources you want, but you don't have energy as one of those resources. You can't do anything. And then also the environment. We have to understand both things we take out and the pollution we put back in. You look at the pictures from, say, China and their pollution levels. It's clear that the world is saying we have limits. And so the accelerated crash course takes that whole body of work and crushes it down to just 53 minutes and moves right along. But it provides the essential context I think people need. If you want to understand what's going on in Iraq, you have to understand what's happening with respect to energy at this part of the game.
This is a knockdown, drag out. It's going to be bloody. I mean, they're fighting over water and dams. They're fighting over oil. They're fighting over supremacy. It's the Hatfields and McCoys. Give us your take on how bad is this going to affect us here in America, and how ugly is it going to get over there?
Well, what's interesting, Greg, is the U.S. media goes out of its way to pretend like this is just a random thing that happened. A bunch of crazy people came out of Syria and are causing trouble. We got to go all the way back 100 years, understand the history that Iraq was not even a country until a Frenchman and a British guy drew some random lines on a map and called it Iraq. And they did that specifically to control the oil interests. So for over 100 years, the people of Iraq have had their oil taken, stripped out, used by Western nations, Western companies. And guess what? That's bred some resentment. Plus, they have all of their old tribal and religious and other sectarian violence pieces and ways they get along and don't get along laid on top of that. But at the heart of this story, if you want to understand, why we're in there so deeply, why we got in there both for Desert Storm 1 and 2, you have to understand the oil story. And this isn't a Republican, it isn't a Democrat thing. We have the Carter Doctrine, which was a Democrat laying down why we're going to have, we, the U.S., a permanent military presence protecting our oil in the Middle East. Well, guess what? I happen to think, personal opinion, that we botched very badly both the second invasion, because we did it on the basis of what was turned out to be truly falsified information, and secondarily, the post-reconstruction effort. If it wasn't designed to fail, it was the biggest bungling job ever in all of history. We dismantled key institutions. We took their army and dismantled that, stripped it away, and left the country a hollowed-out shell. And guess what? Now that's breaking. Here's why it affects us. Oil and oil infrastructure is fragile stuff. It's complex. A refinery is thousands of moving parts, miles and miles of tubes and pipes and crackers and stacks. One mortar lobbed in there, and that whole refinery gets shut down. Pipelines. You can have all the oil fields in the world, but if you can't get that oil to market, if it can't get on a ship, if you can't get it there, it's not worth anything. Everything in Iraq is transported by pipelines. Those are 2,000-mile-long beast that any one person on any one segment of that can destroy that pipeline, which just happened in Iraq in April. A big pipeline and a pair of pipelines got destroyed. So the idea that we can now have full-blown Sunni, Shia, Kurd mixing match where they're going to duke it out for power and have all that oil infrastructure remain untouched, I think is a fantasy.
You think oil prices go up from here? I mean, in other words, they're already creeping up in the $110, $15. You're saying we're going higher.
Well, the chance is very, very high. I don't see this discounted in the markets at all right now, not in the equity markets, not in the bond markets, not even in the oil markets at this point in time. If you really wanted to discount that effect, the chance here is that the Basra oil terminal actually gets hit. And if that does, 2.5 million barrels per day of exported oil goes offline. And this is the key. It doesn't matter how much is produced in the world. It matters how much is exported. Because if you're a nation that's dependent on imports, you need oil you care about what's exported. So that market is only about 35 million barrels. 2.5 million barrels of that is Iraqi. So that means, we're closing in on 8% of the world market. If that goes away, oil prices are set at the margin. That 2.5 million barrels going off brings us to 150. If something worse happens, Saudi Arabia gets involved, the terminals at Riyadh get destroyed, or worse yet, the Strait of Hormuz gets closed down, then we're talking about numbers, pick one, 200, that might even seem cheap. We don't know how high oil could go. If this turns into a regional conflict, that's the risk. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the risk is on the table now.
Well, we have really made a mess of things. I mean, and we're in a very difficult position. President Obama was talking about whack-a-mole. You can't treat these terrorists, these militants like whack-a-mole. Go after them. And I'm thinking, well, boy, he's being awful cagey. Well, look at the position we're in. If we help the Maliki government, the Iranians are helping them. So we're helping the people on the axis of evil. If we go after ISIS and start bombing them, then our ally, Saudi Arabia, who's also been arming these al-Qaeda-linked terrorists, they're going to say, oh, whoa, wait, we may want to trade oil in something other than dollars. I mean, that's what's going on. Then the president has asked for another $500 million to help, the Syrian rebels, which have a huge al-Qaeda component. What a mess. This is going to get worse before it gets better, is it not?
It absolutely is. And, the old saying in the Middle East is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So look at this at this point. Syria's been bombing the ISIS rebels. Iran has also been helping the Maliki government on their side. So if the U.S. comes in and does anything against the ISIS rebels, we are now on the same side as Syria and Iran, the same people that were about to spend $500 million to fight in the north. And Iran, of course, are arch enemies. And so all of this doesn't make sense. Obviously, if you're trying to follow the moves, none of it makes sense. You have to back up and note that there's been a master strategy in play for the Middle East for a long time. It's called divide and conquer. We've been looking at, you can read documents that were put out by the same people who put out Project for a New American Century talking about the plan for the whole region back in the 90s. And the plan included breaking Iraq into 3 states, right? You want a Kurdistan, you want a Sunni place, you want a Shiite place, primarily because if they're divided like that, then it's much easier to control the various assets in that country. So, whether there's a master plan like that running or not, I tend to be of the mind that if people say they're going to do something and then it happens, that's probably an explanation for what occurred. So if we go for this broken up Iraq, though, to my mind, this smells again of neocon fantasies. We'll just break them up. We'll be like puppet masters and it'll all work like we want it to. They'll greet us as liberators with flowers, right? Guess what? It never quite works out that way. And I think you've hit on the important point. Once you let this genie out of the bottle and you unleash millennia of interfighting and bad blood, there's no predicting what can happen next at that point. I think it's been a huge mistake to sow chaos and discord. And listen, how many countries did we do this to? We broke Libya in exactly the same way because we wanted to get rid of a bad guy, Muammar Gaddafi. Now that place has 0 oil exports pretty much at this point because the country is completely wrecked by sectarian violence. The same thing has happened in Egypt, where we supported one side, then the other, got rid of the standing government. It's a mess. Syria, it's a mess, right? Iraq now is a mess. And so as I look across this, I go, wow, mess, mess, mess. Maybe that is the plan. It makes sense to me. And that plan is always centered around how can we, the West, better control the oil interests of those countries. This is critical because Europe is desperately needing oil at this point in time and natural gas. They are now overall global importers of that energy. The United States this year, still a net importer of natural gas. Still, we import 7 million barrels a day of crude oil out of the 15 that we burn. And you look at all the countries that are really wading into the Middle East, and you've got basically all of them are net energy importers. This is what makes sense now.
This is the backdrop for possible World War III.
All wars of history have been resource wars at their core. And, of course, Russia and China won the state oil contracts out of Iraq back in 2009 when the bidding came down. Surprised everybody that the U.S. and Western companies, Total out of France and Eni out of Italy, all got locked out of the bidding process. We were all disappointed. Those were supposed to be what are called revenue sharing contracts. We pull some oil out, you get 70%, we take 30%. That's a sweet deal. Iraq wanted to do $1 per barrel deal. It's called a service contract, buck and a half a barrel. Less of a sweet deal. Russia said okay, China said okay, and the U.S. felt bitter about that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Europe because Ukraine, another resource war, to your point. I mean, their gas pipelines there. Austria last week came out and said, oh, we're going to have that Russian pipeline. We're going to bypass Ukraine. The Ukrainians' cheap gas has been cut off now by the Russians because, oh, you want to be independent? Okay, you got to pay market price and pay us up front. And then look at Europe. They do not want to have sanctions. I've been saying this for months. BP just made a big deal with Rosneft in Russia, about $1.5 billion long-term deal. They don't want to have sanctions, and now President Obama says, well, if they don't want to have new sanctions on Russia, well, I won't impose them either. But this is a mess. Isn't this another resource war there? And it could have terrible consequences for Europe.
Absolutely, and already has had consequences. Ukraine has two major pipelines that pass through, that transit from Russia over to Europe. It accounts for about 30% of all the gas that's imported and used in Europe. It's a very, very big number. Austria is going to bypass about half of that if and when that new pipeline deal with Austria gets built up. So Ukraine is slowly getting potentially marginalized out of this particular story. But as it stands right now, the gas transiting through Ukraine, very, very important. It was just a couple weeks ago, one of those two major pipelines blew up in Ukraine. So here we're seeing, again, this is really a story about resources. It's really a story about energy. Ukraine is bargaining hard because they feel like they've got Europe at their back. Europe knows that if Ukraine bargains hard enough and forces Russia to cut off the gas supplies, that they have to cut off Europe's gas supplies. So Ukraine is kind of playing hardball, trusting that won't happen. But really, this is ultimately, again, just a story of resources. It was a year ago that Russia and China announced a major breakthrough in a deal, and it was only a month and a half ago that they signed that deal to take essentially 20% of all Russian exportable gas starting in 2018 is going to go to China. Nobody knows where that extra gas is going to come from. And the only thing that could really help here is if Russia vastly increases production. It's hard work. It's expensive. It takes time. And guess what? These sanctions that they're talking about right now, levying against Russia, if Russia doesn't stop the violence in the Ukraine, is specifically targeting the energy sector. So no more Western supplies, no more Western technology, drill rigs, bits, pipes, all of that stuff. That would all get locked out. And so ultimately, this is the positioning that's happening right now with the United States really playing fast and loose with Europe's energy supplies. And if I'm Europe, I would be... Let's just say Europe shouldn't come crying to anybody if in a year they find themselves in a deep energy crisis because they were following along with this idea that it was a good idea to basically poke sharp sticks at your only gas station, on the corner. That's what's really going on here. But the larger story around this is to understand that there just aren't new resources to go around. We know where they all are. All the supplies are spoken for. And there's no clear sign of where we're going to get new stuff. So really, the pie is now fixed, and we're scrambling over who gets what. China wants its share. China overtook the United States as the number one importer of petroleum last year. They produce more electricity than the U.S., and that's a really big sort of a sea change in this whole story. And guess what? The shale drilling is not going to be able to make up the difference, not even close. So this is a real scramble for resources. All wars have been resource wars. And now when I look at the geopolitical landscape, Middle East and in Eastern Europe, I say this story has already started to unravel. And if you don't understand resources, it won't make a lick of sense.
I know you're also an expert in finance, large finance too. And so let's get round to the finance story, to the derivatives and the leverage and all that. And your crash course covers, we're living beyond our means in terms of, resources. That's pretty obvious. Also, but we're living way beyond our means with all this printed money. This crash is coming, and it is going to affect the financial markets, currencies, stocks, bonds, everything, correct?
Absolutely. 2008 was the shot across the bow. That's when our credit experiment broke, and we've been doing everything possible to paper over it since. So let's again widen the lens and look at the big picture. Starting in the early 1980s, the United States and most of the developed world started doing something really odd. We started borrowing money at about twice the rate that our income was growing. So about 8% per year was how fast our credit markets were growing, right? So this is everything: auto loans, student loans, state, federal, municipal debt, corporate debt, all of that. Anything you can think of that says debt on it, not liabilities, just debt, was growing at 8% per year, and perfect exponential growth. And our GDP under that was growing at about 3%. So as a private individual, if your credit card debt is growing at, say, 10%, your salary's growing at 5%, sooner or later you have a big problem on your hands. That problem started to break in 2008, shot across the bow. Perfect time for us to say, whoa, we were living beyond our means. We were borrowing more than we were earning. Now we got to sort of live beneath our means for a while. That's what a private individual has to do. That's what a country has to do. And instead, what we said was not going there. The federal government went deeper into debt at an astonishing pace to make up for the shortfalls in private borrowing. The Federal Reserve made money at prices at at levels we've never seen before in the data series. And derivatives only got larger, and the too big to fail banks only got larger. So you look at that whole suite of things and you say, instead of saying, wow, maybe we have to do things differently, we said we're going to do it, but we're just going to do it over here in the public sector for a while. And I think that was just an enormous mistake. And so the bottom line is simply this: all those things I just mentioned, whether it's currency, money, what people call money, whether it's debt instruments, treasury bonds, notes, mortgage-backed securities, whether it's derivatives, all of those things are just claims on real wealth. Real wealth is what happens when you take real stuff out of the ground. You grow food, you take oil out of the ground, you process ore into steel, you manufacture real things. That's real wealth. The claims have to be in proportion to the real wealth. The claims have been growing and growing and growing for so long that they are now way out of balance to the real stuff, and the real stuff isn't growing like it used to. We can see that in the GDP numbers for the U.S., for the world at large. Growth is slowing, and the claims are getting larger and larger. This represents a huge, gigantic source of potential energy. There's a gap there, and it's going to get closed. And only one of two things can happen. One, real stuff suddenly starts expanding like crazy, or two, the claims get destroyed. That's what we're talking about when we say a market crash. The claims get destroyed. People get wiped out.
The bonds, the currency.
Stocks, all of it. And they can get destroyed in two ways. Defaults, right? So it all goes to, everything sort of gets reduced towards zero, or it goes into an inflationary mode. We don't know which way it's going to break yet. The Federal Reserve's trying to get the inflationary path ignited. Japan's trying to ruin its own currency. But still, the deflationary forces are in balance with that. That's the awkward place we're at right now. But it's going to break one of two ways. And my position is, it doesn't matter if you're in financial assets, whether it breaks by inflation or deflation, you get ruined. The people who don't get ruined are safely over here in the real wealth already. Everybody over here who's getting ruined is trying to get over to real wealth. So if you own an unencumbered farm, if you happen to own a productive asset, a business, if you happen to own gold or silver, if you happen to own your house outright, those are all things that you own over in the real space. And if you own them outright, you are going to be vastly safer than somebody who's levered, owes a lot, is hinged into this other system.
Well, when it crashes, does that money just go poof? I got a friend of mine, Greg Manarino, says, hey, money doesn't go to money heaven, it transfers. What do you say about that?
Well, it does to an extent. So when we look back at Weimar Germany, right? So this whole episode starts about 1917, and by 1923, it's burned itself out. And we've all seen the pictures of people with wheelbarrows of money shoveling them into their furnace, right? Because it was worth more to burn than as paper currency. What happened, if you read books about that, they still say, hey, there was this vast wealth destruction. The middle class was wiped out. All these people lost their entire savings. All true. But it wasn't wealth destruction, because if the real wealth of the nation, before and after the money burned itself out, there were just as many people, just as many hotels, just as many hectares of arable land and farms. There were just as many productive factories. All of that real wealth was still there. Who owned it changed dramatically. The people who had access to real money at that point in time, real wealth or the real wealth itself, they did fine. In fact, some of them made out like bandits, right? You know, you've heard the story about the bellhop who bought the entire hotel he worked at in downtown Berlin for a single gold coin because that was the transfer that could be made. This is the thing that people don't really understand yet that would be better if they did, is that this wealth destruction's coming, but it's really a wealth transfer. And you can be either on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. And to be on the right side of the line means that you actually already have access to that real wealth. Because when this starts to break, Greg, it's going to be really fast. People are going to be paralyzed. Those who have a plan and access to liquid currency might be able to execute some of that. But the stampede for the door will be so magnificent, I think very few people will be able to do much. You know, this is a story you'd much rather be a year early than a day late to.
You know, a lot of people on my site are gold and silver buyers, and I'm going to speak for them here. And this is my read on them, that they're not trying to hit a big one. They're not trying to, I want to make 10-fold or 50-fold, or I want to get 10,000 or 50,000 gold. They're scared. People on my site are scared, and they want to preserve their assets so they can help their friends and their families. They want to preserve what capital they have in the form of gold, silver, artwork, land, whatever. They're buying things. They're not greedy. They're fearful. Is this a good way to look at what's coming down?
Absolutely. You know, the whole money system is just so off the rails at this point in time. You know, everybody ought to keep a journal. This is the most extraordinary experiment that's ever been run. Never before have we tried to print money at this level on a global scale. And that's the scary part, because in times past, there was a border you could duck over. I talked about Weimar Germany. It was bad, but if you were at all sophisticated, there were Swiss francs, there were French francs, there were English sterling, there were US dollars, there was gold itself. There were all sorts of ways that you could escape that. Today, where would you go if you don't like the dollar? Do you go to euros? Do you go into yen, rubles, yuan? They're all facing the exact same scenario. So to take a step out of that and say, I'm going to put my money into gold and silver is a way of just saying, this is wealth. It looks like money. It tastes like money. It plays like money, but it's out of this other system. I think that's very prudent, and it makes a lot of sense. And there are other things people can put their wealth into that make a lot of sense. You know, in my own case, I've made investments in my home energy infrastructure with solar thermal panels that have a triple-digit internal rate of return. Can't find that on Wall Street. I've put it into the living capital. I've traded money for compost and for fruit trees and for getting my land that I have on this little suburban lot I'm on up to snuff. So I'm just finding ways to get my liquid currency out of the system into things that look like real wealth. And depending on the amount of money you have, I see this happening all the time. The very wealthy people are doing things like stashing gold in multiple jurisdictions, buying big pieces of land and farmland in various countries. These are all, I think, prudent courses of action to take when you have concern that the 12 people who make up the Federal Open Market Committee might not actually have had complete training in the sociological impacts and political impacts of messing around with a nation's currency in an attempt to destroy people's faith in it. So, yeah, step out of the system as much as you can. It's much better to be early to this story than late.
What's this going to look like to the people trying to squeeze through that little bitty exit door? What are they going to be facing if they don't get their house in order ahead of time?
Yeah, Cyprus was the trial run. We already saw this. The powers that be gave a trial run on this. They took a tiny island nation. In theory, it's completely possible to ring fence that island nation. They shut the banks down on a Friday afternoon. People couldn't get access to their funds for weeks, if not longer. And they did the bail-in, where they seized a whole bunch of assets above a certain level. What we discovered, which was fascinating in that story, was that even though it was a tiny island nation and they completely shut down all banking transactions, that somehow rich oligarchs and other well-connected people either got their money out a couple weeks before, but still managed to pull their money out even while the banks were closed. So it's kind of tight and kind of tough. But that was our first warning sign of what it looks like. The average person wakes up, the markets are closed. When the markets open again, you are one of millions of people trying to do something, and it's almost impossible to get anything out of it. The ATM says, sorry, transaction limits $100 per customer per day. And that's all you can do, right? Which is exactly what they did, except in euros in the Cyprus case. So it's a case where you just wake up one day and you don't have access to the liquidity you thought you did.
And the assets in a given country, or in this case the world, are just going to transfer. They're still going to be there. The oil wells are going to be there. The farmland's going to be there. The houses are going to be there, unless we have nuclear war. You know, I mean, the title changes hands.
Well, look at this. Who is the largest residential real estate holder in the entire country at this point? It's the Federal Reserve. They own $1.25 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. Those things linked directly to the largest landlord in this country right now is the Federal Reserve. How did the Federal Reserve come up with $1.25 trillion worth of housing in this country? Well, they printed money out of thin air. That's how they got their hands on it. It's an amazing system when you really step back and look at it.
So there is meaning to their madness. They're buying all these bonds, but they're buying all these houses.
Well, they bought real assets, and I can't fault them for that, but it just seems absolutely bizarre to me that we live in a nation where there was exactly zero congressional hearings about that. There was no oversight. There was no ability for any elected person or a voting citizen to weigh in on that whatsoever. We had no choice in the matter.
Chris Martenson, thank you for coming on and explain to us, this coming crash. One last thing. I've been saying that I think people say, well, when is it going to happen? That's the big question. When? And I've been saying, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think 2014 is going to be a replay of 2007, only worse. And 2015 is going to be a replay of 2008, only way worse. What say you about the timing of this coming accelerated crash in your accelerated crash course?
Well, I can't predict when it's going to happen. All I can do is, it's like trying to predict when an avalanche is going to go or an earthquake is going to happen. Nobody can predict those. Even scientists who've studied these things intensely with all the best models they can. But what we can do scientifically is we can look at the risks. So if a fault hasn't released and it's supposed to release and it's way overdue, we can tell two things. The chance of it releasing sooner than later is larger, and the chance of it being bigger than smaller is larger. So we've just been building the risks up. And so in my world, I think that it's prudent to prepare for this idea that we're going to have a very large financial accident, and the chance of it happening sooner than later is there. We don't know what's going to trigger it, right? Every bubble is in search of a pin. Well, who knows? Maybe Putin finally gets ticked off enough and he declares open warfare. Maybe the Middle East really blows up and we find that oil is over 200 a barrel. Who knows? It doesn't matter. What's going to happen is that this vast experiment with overprinting and over-indebtedness is going to come to an end, and it's just looking for a reason. I see lots of potential reasons right now on the drawing board. Here's looking forward into the summer of 2014. Wouldn't surprise me at all to see it happen sometime in 2014. And if it doesn't, the risk is only higher it'll happen in 2015. Again, because we didn't take the prudent course of fixing and reducing these risks. We doubled down and made them larger.
And I guess now the only thing you can do is get out there and protect yourself in the ways that you have lined out. Buy gold, buy silver, buy solar panels, buy food. Get yourself out of the system.
Yeah, do it for yourself, do it for your family, do it for your neighbors. It is an act of selflessness, not selfishness, to be prepared. I don't understand why some people think it's prudent for the government to prepare for a big emergency, but not for individuals. I don't understand that thinking at all. And honestly, I think that you have to be the change you wish to see. If you want your town to be prepared, it starts with you. So that's what we talk about at Peak Prosperity, are all the ways people, whether young or old, rich or poor, urban, rural, it doesn't matter. Everybody can do something to become prepared. We talk about financial preparations and resilience, great. Physical preparations and resilience, great. And this is important, emotional preparations. Because it's not going to be the financial accident itself that hurts most people. It's going to be the response to it. And we've already seen this in other nations that have gone through this process. People's typical response is to turn to drinking, is to turn to self-destructive behaviors because their livelihood went away, because their story about how they added value went away. Something happened in their life, and that's typically the thing that harms people the most. So we talk about all three of those big areas, and it's here's the good news. Once you start going down this path, most people say, hey, I am so glad I started that because I feel better, my anxiety's reduced. Hey, I'm eating healthier, I've got these better relationships, I know my neighbors better, and I can sleep well at night because I know that no matter what, the wealth I do have now is not going to go to zero because somebody, flicked a pen on Friday night at the Oval Office. So this is all, to us, has a very, very positive side, which is we can live fulfilling lives, lots of meaning, better connections with the people around us, and it all starts with understanding that The old way of life was unsustainable. It's coming to a close. Let's give a little cheer for it, say thank you very much, that was fun. What's this new world look like? That's what we're about at Peak Prosperity, is looking into that future and saying, we want to be the shapers of that, not the people who are shaped by it.
The accelerated crash course on peakprosperity.com. Chris Martenson, thank you for joining us today on usawatchdog.com and helping us out understanding this complicated, huge problem going on around the globe.
Greg, it's been my pleasure.